Everyone. We are a couple minutes after the hour, and so we'll begin our third installment in the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities webinar series, Building Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion into Bioethics and Health Humanities Scholarship and Practice. I am very excited to introduce to you today our speaker, Florence Ashley, and we have a special guest, Theodore Schall, who will be moderating the Q&A. I'm going to introduce them both, and then we will get started with the main event. Florence Ashley is a trans feminine jurist, bioethicist, activist, and scholar who is currently a doctoral student at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law and the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics. Their work engages law, bioethics, social sciences, and trans studies to critically examine clinical practices towards trans youth, with a special emphasis on trans conversion therapy. Florence obtained degrees in law and bioethics from McGill University and served as the first openly trans feminine clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada, working in the chambers of Justice Sheila Martin. Florence's work uses law, bioethics, social sciences, and trans studies to address a wide variety of topics, with particular emphasis on clinical practices involving trans youth. They are the author of the 2022 book, Banning Transgender Conversion Practices, a Legal and Policy Analysis, and serve on the editorial board of the Bulletin of Applied Transgender Studies. Outside of the university, Florence frequently contributes to media conversations on trans issues through op-eds and interviews. For their academic work, public advocacy, and leadership in trans communities, Florence was awarded the 2018-2019 Canadian Bar Association SOGIC Hero Award. So we're very, very pleased to have Florence here with us today to speak about an issue that is extremely timely and has been the source of a great deal of distress and concern among the bioethics and humanities communities here in the US. I also want to introduce Theodore Schall. Theo is a trans man and has been involved in trans civil rights activism for 15 years. He holds a master's in bioethics and a master's in social work from Penn, is ABD at Johns Hopkins in bioethics and health policy, and is an incoming assistant professor of health policy and management at the UMass Amherst School of Public Health and Health Sciences. This is his second year as the group leader for the ASBH Sexual and Gender Minority Affinity Group. Thank you, Theo, for joining us for the moderation. And with that, I will turn it over to Florence.
Hi, everybody. Also, I really like the fact that the PowerPoint granted me my SJD about 1 month ahead of time, because I'm defending next month. I'm also going to be joining the University of Alberta Faculty of Law, which is why I am currently in Edmonton and not on the same time zone as a lot of other people. So there's a tragic element in the history of trans bioethics, and it's the fact that just as the voices of trans communities really began making their way into the discipline of bioethics, our ability to better the world was foreclosed by political developments that hijacked bioethical deliberations in favor of an eliminationist agenda that sees transitude, the fact of being trans, as an unacceptable form of life. And we're a little over a third of the way through 2023, and already 49 states have proposed 543 anti-trans bills, of which 70 were adopted in 19 states. I would assume that number was from earlier this week. It has already changed. And as of this week, there's 372 bills that remain active. And that's not counting, of course, all the previous years and the rest of the year to come. These bills, which initially purported to protect youth from what they called experimental treatments, are rapidly expanding and changing shape. It's no longer just a matter of banning medical care for trans youth. We're not talking about also taking away trans youth from their families if they're suspected of being affirming, which is essentially kind of kidnapping. setting up for making trans youth medical care punishable by the death penalty through defining it as a sexual offense and then adding death penalty to sexual offenses, expanding bans to adult care, including through the use of ableist narratives around autistic adults or mental illness and things like that, banning trans youth from sports, banning trans people from bathrooms, banning trans people from public platforms by labeling them as obscene, allowing for conscientious objection to refuse treating LGBTQ plus folks, banning any mention of gender identity in school, including forcing teachers and staff to misgender and out trans children, which is something we're also seeing being increasingly talked about in Canada quite worrisomely, banning books around, trans issues and trans realities by labeling them as pornographic, banning DEI initiatives, and even banning all social justice-oriented courses like gender studies and studies around anti-Black racism and things like that. And this is all occurring against the background of a broader movement that calls for the eradication of what they call transgenderism, that labels as criminals and as groomers anyone who doesn't oppose gender affirmation and anyone who acknowledges trans existence, that harasses and threatens drag events and gender-affirming clinicians, including with bomb and death threats, and at times openly calls for the public execution of those who support gender-affirming care. This is a movement that's tied to a broader culture war narrative that tries to abolish tenure, lauds anti-Black violence, censors any mention of racism and anti-Blackness, attacks access to abortion, dehumanizes immigrants and refugees, and demonstrates a deep, deep callousness towards disabled people who were the most impacted by COVID and by neoliberal privatization. So my presentation is going to be divided into two parts. In the first part, I'll take a more polemical form in the classical sense of impassioned argument to really work in that honored tradition, trying to convince people to care. And then the second part will return to what might be more of a conventional pedagogical tone for a webinar, where I'll be talking much more in detail about what can be done. So let me go into the polemics now. So no doubt we've learned different stories about the genesis of bioethics, and no doubt the stories that we hold on to have profoundly shaped what we see as our profession's place in the world and our place within our profession. The story that I was told began in Nazi-occupied Europe, where medicine and medical research were distorted by a fascist regime to serve an agenda of racial hygiene, a euphemism for the violent eradication of Jewish, Romani, disabled, queer, and trans people. Under Nazi rule, medicine's purpose was not to heal, let alone serve all so that they could pursue their own visions of the good life. Its purpose was instead to benefit the so-called Aryan race. And as the Nazi regime came crumbling down, the Nuremberg Code was adopted in the hopes that the inhumanities of Nazism could never rise again. Now, I'm not telling you this because the Nuremberg Code succeeded. Medical fascism did not end on that fateful day of 1947. Otherwise, how could we explain the profound anti-Blackness of things like the Tuskegee experiment and ongoing and historical experimentation on Black communities? No, I'm telling you this because of what it tells us about bioethics as a discipline. Bioethics was born amidst a post-war turn towards human rights and became institutionalized across the United States on the heels of the civil rights movement. Bioethics did not arise so that we privileged clinicians, researchers, and scholars could take pleasure in pursuing some abstract moral truth and endlessly debate about it. It emerged from a call for humanity and for a call to the end of prejudice. Bioethics, if it is to have any value in society whatsoever, cannot forget its goal of human freedom and the pursuit of happiness for all. Will we as a profession serve fascism? Will we fight it, or will we simply stand by as it wreaks havoc? In the last few years, a dozen states have adopted laws criminalizing gender-affirming care for minors, and well over a dozen more have proposed bills to the same effect. After half a decade of proclaiming that they were only concerned with saving the children, as the familiar fascist slogan goes, a handful are now attempting to ban gender-affirming care at all ages. Now, I won't bore you with arguments about how gender-affirming care is ethical, is backed by science, and widely supported by major professional association. You've already heard these arguments, and if you haven't, you can just DM me, I'll send you a link. No, the first reason why I won't do that is that, well, first, my time is limited. And the second, and perhaps the most important one, is that these arguments are essentially a distraction, because legislative attacks on trans care are not about science, about bioethics, or about good medical practice. They're about fascism, medical fascism. Fascism uses and abuses medicine to mark certain people as undesirable, as unworthy. Bans on gender-affirming care are an attempt to marginalize trans communities and exclude them from a definition of a life worth living. That's why those who push for the bans, though they sometimes purport to merely follow the science, simultaneously call for, quote unquote, the elimination of transgenderism. And that's why these bans are also sorted with laws that mandate the removal of trans kids from their families, that ban mention of trans existence in school, that ban trans kids from participating in sports or accessing bathrooms, and that ban drag, often framed so broadly as to remove any and all trans people from public view. Attacks on gender-affirming care are part of medical fascism. Their end goal is the same as that of the broader movement, which is the end of trans life in the public sphere. Trans people may be relatively few in society, and that's been enough for many to ignore what's happening. But fascism is rarely satisfied with attacking only one group. In some of the most famous pictures of Nazi book burning, if you look closely, you can see a bust of Magnus Hirschfeld. Adolf Hitler is said to have called him the world's most dangerous Jew. The books being burned in those pictures were looted from his Institut für Sexualwissenschaft in 1933. Pardon my terrible German. To the Nazis, his work of promoting acceptance for queer and trans people was essentially a Jewish conspiracy to corrupt society. And it would be easy to ignore these facts as mere historical trivia, were it not for the constant contemporaneous allegation that transgenderism is a Jewish conspiracy. And for the record, the last time I've seen somebody make that claim was last week, when there was yet another pamphlet targeting Jewish individuals for defending trans rights, distributed through Atlanta. Now we can draw more connections. You know, how the bioessentialism underneath anti-trans movement is the same that white supremacists use to claim that abortion goes against women's nature in response to fears of white genocide. And in fact, you can keep on the lookout. I have an article coming out in Truth Out about that with my colleague and friend Blue Buchanan. But the core point is this: fascists have a whole laundry list of people that they consider undesirable and unworthy. Trans people are just the easiest to pick on. After all, nobody seems to care enough to stand up to medical fascism for us. And that creates a precedent that they can use to attack other groups afterwards. So what have we bioethicists done? You know, have we done enough to stand up for medical fascism? What have we done, and what have you, as somebody who's listening, done? Bioethics was invented so that fascism, racism, prejudice could no longer take hold of medicines. And too often, as a profession, we've looked the other way right when it did. We continue doing so all the time. Too few of us have done anything to fight the restoration of abortion rights. Too few of us have done anything to fight medical racism and anti-Blackness. Will bioethics be remembered for its inaction in the face of medical fascism and genocidal populisms, or will it be remembered for honoring its roots and its history by refusing to abandon marginalized people and fighting for their freedom to define who they are and pursue happiness on their own terms? Because if gender-affirming care falls, it's the very soul of bioethics that's in jeopardy. Because if bioethics cannot fight for what is right, then what good is it for? So that's my polemics part. And now I turn to the longer part, which is, what does it look like doing bioethics in a moral panic? what can we do as a profession and as individuals to protect trans communities? And how can we, of course, guide and support clinicians who are being prevented from providing gender-affirming care, who must navigate oversight or restrictions on their teaching, or facing public pressure not to speak to the media or not to publicly defend gender-affirming care? Now, I don't have any simple solution or answer. There's no kind of singular catch-all panacea, but there's a constellation of solutions that I want to offer that are just part of the bigger picture of solutions, and that revolve around 3 points. The first one is emphasizing human rights in our work, to knowing what you need to know to fight misinformation and to resist these reactionary movements. And third, using the power and the authority that you have. So the first point is about emphasizing human rights. And here I want to say that we need to go back to the human rights that are at the roots of bioethics. We need to really think about the fact of attacks on gender-affirming care, not just about, as you know, in terms of medical debates and things like that, and not just about levels of evidence, etc., but really think about the way in which eliminationist measures are fundamentally incompatible with respect for persons and justice, for those who like to use a framework of principlism. And of course, we're all used to kind of translating those principles into principles that we prefer, because, you know, we all know that principlism is not necessarily as popular as some like to think. Now, what does that mean is to emphasize the humanity of trans people, to emphasize how they are people, how they should get to have a say in what kind of lives they're living, what kind of lives they get to see as worth living. We also need to emphasize the humanity of trans people by really highlighting and emphasizing how the measures are tangibly impacting them on day-to-day life. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, they won't have access to this type of care, which a lot of people don't really necessarily grasp what that means tangibly, what that means for, you know, a kid who's going to go through a puberty that feels so completely opposed to their idea of who they are as a person, and will lead to changes in their body that will make them feel increasingly disconnected from it, alienated from it. We need to talk about the fact that access to gender-affirming care is oftentimes a precondition for people's full and equal access to the public sphere and participation within it. As somebody who's is in partial remission of agoraphobia, according to my psychiatrist, well, ex-psychiatrist, I guess. A lot of my agoraphobia was relieved when I transitioned, because, you know, this ability to see myself in my own body, in my own actions, allowed me to participate in the public sphere and society much more. And I mean, anybody who goes through my CV can in fact straight up guess when I transition, solely based on what on my CV, because it goes from like there being nothing to, you know, me participating in society so much, in part to fight injustices, but also in part just because I finally felt like, you know, it was worth fighting for the world. It was worth being in the world. Part of this idea of human rights is also emphasizing, you know, the idea of gender self-determination. There is a right to gender self-determination that we have and that we need to recognize as a matter of human right, and that this right to gender self-determination, this principle of gender self-determination, creates a presumptive right to gender-affirming care. And that, you know, it's not for us to have to prove that it's effective at helping mental health. No, we have a right to define what kind of life we want to live, who we get to be as gendered beings. And that means that it's those who want to curtail gender-affirming care that have to muster evidence that will rebut that presumption. And let me tell you, if you think that the quality, if they claim that the quality of the evidence in favor of gender-affirming care is bad, can you imagine how bad the evidence against it is? There's, well, none, really. There's none, let alone any good one. So emphasizing gender self-determination is really an important way of emphasizing, the human rights that are part of gender-affirming care, and how these rights are much bigger than just a question of medicine and of science. As part of, falling back on human rights thinking and consideration, I think it's important to collectively remind institutions, remind administrators, and remind colleagues that want to take the easy way out and give in to the moral panic, either by adopting it as their own or by kind of simply deciding to stop offering care because of it. To remind them that stopping providing care out of fear of backlash is not something that is ethical. Reminding them that withholding care is not ethically neutral, and that the principle of non-maleficence requires offering care to people. And so in that way, even though non-maleficence has oftentimes been distorted as an excuse against gender-affirming care, it actually pushes in the other direction. It pushes against the idea of just abandoning trans youth. And as much as it's tempting to, let go of human rights and fall back on traditional scientific logics and talking, about studies and overemphasizing beneficence, the problem with that is that overemphasizing science makes it so much easier for those who attack gender-affirming care to just manipulate and fabricate scientific authority, as we've seen in Florida. There's so much information that's coming out of court discovery right now and trial, but also out of a lot of kind of leaked emails and leaked documentations around organizations like the ADF or the American College of Pediatrics that shows them very actively trying to create evidence against gender-affirming care. And, of course, that is something that they do because it's so easy to deploy double standards and appeal to nice-sounding ideas like evidence-based medicine and rapid onset gender dysphoria to crack down on gender-affirming care without looking at the ways in which gender-affirming care is, while on the one hand quite different from the rest of medicine, much in the same way that reproductive care is, because it's so tied up in people's personhood, is also far from being out of line with what is commonly done in medicine, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, notably around the idea of evidence-based medicine. But, those double standards can really only be properly highlighted if we turn back to human rights, turn back to justice, turn back to respect for persons. Another reason why I think these traditional scientific logics fail is that they don't highlight the real problem, right? They don't highlight the justice aspect of it. They don't highlight the role, the critical role that gender-affirming care plays in trans lives, way beyond, mere kind of like medical treatment. And that's not to kind of undermine the importance of medical treatment, but more to emphasize this kind of definitional nature to gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care partly defines who we get to be as gendered being in society. And while there's, of course, other forms of medicine that have, similar wide-ranging implications, access to abortion is a clear example, it's also not the most kind of common thing in medicine, right? Like, I take ADHD medication, I will function much better with them, but not having the medication didn't radically change who I got to be in society and my relationships, to the world, and to people. Now, the second point is that we need to know, the second point is that there's certain things that you need to know in order to counter misinformation. It's really, really important for bioethicists writ large and really kind of as a whole to learn them, not just those who work in trans care, because you're going to have colleagues, you're going to have people around you who are going to try to spread misinformation, and you need to know a lot of things to just be able to say, no, that's not actually correct. That is not how things work. And that is misinformation. And we need to try to like nip that in the bud. The first one that I want to talk about is this idea of social contagion or rapid onset gender dysphoria. This is an idea that emerged now about a little bit over 5 years ago, that essentially says, oh, there is, an explosion of trans youth. That is actually because there's a new type of trans people or people who believe that they're trans, and it spreads through social contagion. That's bad. Therefore, we should, crack down on gender-affirming care. Well, the first thing to point out is there's no evidence of this, right? The data that was collected and presented is, yes, you could argue compatible with this, but also compatible with everything else we know about trans care, which is to say, if you collect information from non-affirming parents who spend their time on anti-trans websites, of course, they're going to say that their kid came out of the blue, that their kid, is transitioning because they hate themselves or because they're influenced by their friends, that they're going to report their kid to have a degradation in mental health because, well, coming out and being rejected is not exactly good for your mental health. And we also know that in the context of queer and trans kids, parental reports are generally not really reliable. It's one thing to use parental reports on certain things that, are a little bit further away from the personal biographical core of the kid, and things that we can generally expect kids to just share with their parents. Or if we're talking about, like, say, externalizing behavioral problems, parents can, there's definitely information we can gather from parents from that. But it's a whole different thing when we are talking about, the experience of youths who were hesitant to share things with their parents, who were seeking information in private on the internet or in friend groups, and then faced, hostility and rejection from their parents. That creates a huge divergence in kind of what the parents and the kids know, and thus we can't really rely on what the parents say in that context. One of the big problems in this idea of social contagion, beyond the fact that it's just not based on evidence and is really just kind of something that's been deployed over the years, each time somebody saw a rise in the number of trans people trying to access care or coming out, and to kind of essentially drum up panic and restrict access to care. But it's predicated on a view that, first, more trans people going to clinics or coming out must mean this is more trans people in general, which is not the case. For all the data that we have on clinics right now, and if we look at, Europe, where there are more centralized clinics, and therefore it's easier to estimate the entire clinical population, the number of trans kids that are going to clinic is so much lower than what we estimate to be the number of trans people in the population and trans kids in the population. And we're talking, oftentimes fewer than 1 in 20 trans kids are actually going to the clinic. So the bigger question is not so much why is there such an explosion, but why has that explosion been so small? Why are there still so many kids who are not accessing the clinic? And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is that the clinics cannot be trusted. The other is that, trans kids have different desires and needs, not all of which require going to a clinic. Then the second point is that, it's predicated on this idea that not only is there more trans people in general, but having more trans people in general is evidence of contagion, which is, really not something we can support. Now, of course, the definitional questions around what it means to have more trans people. Do we mean more out trans people? Do we mean more people who realize that they're trans? There's a lot of kind of questions going around there. But, there's no evidence that excludes the idea that it's simply something other than contagion. And in fact, most of our estimates of trans people in general are people who are willing to report that they're trans, which requires not only access to the reality that trans people exist, and thus a language through which you can say, oh yes, I'm trans, then a certain degree of social acceptance so that people are willing to admit to themselves that are trans, and then a degree of social safety that makes them willing to admit to others that they're trans. So there's quite a lot of steps in order to get to that evidence. And I'm realizing my camera is so shaky. And then the last step, in that view is that more trans people is bad or that contagion is harmful. Well, the first one is more trans people is bad. Is it? I certainly don't think so. If people are happy and trans, that sounds right to me. And then which gets us to the point of this premise that contagion is harmful, which we don't have evidence of, right? Like if we, for instance, believe that gender is socially constructed, then we're open, presumably, to the idea that there's a certain number of people that through social processes develop an identity as being trans. And that doesn't mean that it's harmful. It could mean that they found an identity that better suits their personality. It could be beneficial, quite so. So, there's simply no evidence through any of those steps in the logical chain. And we need to be able to point that out. Then another thing that we're seeing a lot is this idea that it's experimental treatment, which is related to the idea that gender-affirming care is based on low-quality evidence. Now, the language of experimental treatment first relies on a misunderstanding of label prescriptions, which form a really, really high percentage of medical care, both among adults and especially among youth, because of historically a lot of medication not being tested on youth and then just being prescribed without actually doing the studies. Experimental treatment also requires us to ignore the evidence base from gender-affirming care, which is often tied to the idea that the only evidence base that matters is randomized controlled trials, which I'll get to. And then there's also the fact that to call it experimental treatment and imply that it's unsafe, we must refuse to learn from approval studies and ongoing monitoring by the FDA or from studies that were conducted in other settings that present comparable circumstances. So most notably, puberty blockers, for instance, have been extensively studied for central precocious puberty and found to be generally safe. Now, there are a lot of ethical questions around treatment of central precocious puberty because it implies that there's something wrong with their development, regardless of the opinion of the youth a lot of the time. And thus, there's a question of whether, kind of given that there's no evidence that a lot of the time that you want this and that the desire comes from the clinicians and the patients and the parents, there are questions about whether, any adverse effects are, worth taking. But it has been found to be quite safe among youth who take it for multiple years, oftentimes in lengths that are quite comparable to the length of time trans youth take them, and oftentimes at similar ages. And so we can certainly learn from those studies because they are done in such a kind of similar kind of context at the physiological level, even if the clinical goal is different. Now, the second thing that's tied to this is this idea of low quality evidence, which relies on a fetishization of randomized controlled trials. the problem with that is that randomized controlled trials in gender affirming care are, one, unethical, and two, and I have a forthcoming paper on this with a few friends and colleagues, they're impracticable. We cannot do viable randomized controlled trials in trans care because puberty blockers, hormones have physiologically obvious effects. As soon as the physiological effects start being produced, which is when we would expect to have, benefits accrue on a mental health level, if at all, because puberty blockers are more about preventing the degradation of mental health than improving it. But the moment you start seeing those changes, participants are being unmasked, know which arm they are in. And as occurred in the past for puberty blocker studies that attempted to do RCTs, we can expect the entire control arm to just quit the study and try to get care elsewhere. So how can you run a study if the moment your study gets unmasked, everybody drops out from the control arm on top of a bunch of other issues of selection bias, generalizability, and things like that. I think the technical term is randomized controlled trials of mental health benefits in gender affirming care would be, this again, the technical term, dog shit. The third problem, of course, with these labeling of low quality evidence is that randomized controlled trials are commonly absent in large swaths of medicine. Something also reviewed in the paper, but especially when there are mental health outcome at play, or we're talking about youth, and I mean, one good example also is newborns and things like that. There's a lot of contexts where you simply cannot effectively do randomized controlled trials, or where people don't for a host of reasons. And it's extremely common for medical guidelines to make recommendations that are not based on randomized controlled trials. And much of medical practice, if all of medicine was subject to the same criteria that opponents of gender affirming care want to apply to gender affirming care, about half to most of contemporary medical practices would have to go. And that's a big problem, obviously, because just because something doesn't have a randomized controlled trial doesn't mean that it's not backed by the best possible evidence that we have. Now, and then moving a little bit away from, the pure language of science is another argument that we hear a lot against gender affirming care is accusing those in favor of gender affirming care of being ideologically driven while purporting or pretending that those who oppose it aren't. So I think it's really important here to say, well, first of all, as philosophy of science has, amply discussed over time, there's no such thing as purely objective science. Our values always come to play in the work of selecting questions and in the work of interpretation. I've talked about that in a commentary article called Science Has Always Been Ideological, You Just Don't See It, where I talk about the notion of epistemological violence from Terence Tao, who says essentially that we're committing injustice when we interpret ambivalent data in ways that run against the rights and interests of marginalized groups, and that, all other things being equal, when you have data that can be interpreted in two ways, we should favor the way that is aligned with values such as justice, equality, respect for persons, and things like that. And that comes from the fact that very, very few data cannot be interpreted in multiple ways. I've given you a little bit snippet of that with the so-called evidence for rapid onset gender dysphoria, which in fact could just be easily reinterpreted as evidence that having transphobic parents is bad for your mental health. So there's this kind of failure to recognize being ideologically driven, but it goes even further than that. it's really important to just kind of know and be aware of how little expertise in trans care and specialization in trans care is involved among people who oppose gender affirming care. There are a few people who do have a fair bit of kind of clinical and research expertise with trans people, but by and large, it is people who just kind of jumped into the fray in order to oppose gender affirming care with very little experience with it. And a lot of the time, while entertaining very close relationships with religious conservatives, as we see with the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine and the American College of Pediatricians, which are organizations that have been revealed to work closely with religious conservative legislators in Florida, among other places, in order to ban gender-affirming care. Sometimes, and this was wording that was used in a trial by one of the witnesses, a conclusion in search of evidence. They concluded that they didn't want gender-affirming care and then reverse engineered the evidence that they needed to ban it. As part of that, and somewhat ironically, given the accusations of that they're not ideological, everybody else is the tendency to uncritically deploy the language of mutilation or to draw comparisons between gender-affirming care and Nazi experiments, a Tuskegee study, lobotomies. Yet there are huge differences and obvious differences between these cases to anybody who knows a little bit about their history. First, these were all cases where treatment was done completely without consent, or at the very least coerced and not informed. These were supposed treatments or at least interventions that were completely unsupported by any evidence whatsoever. They did not have support. It wasn't just a matter of questions about the weakness or strength of evidence. There was just no evidence whatsoever. Well, lobotomy is a bit more complicated, but there's also sort of like a return of lobotomies, but that would be a really big detour. So I'm not going to kind of go down that rabbit hole. And in these cases, it typically involved denying established treatments, like treatments for syphilis, simply creating conditions like hypothermia, where we knew that it would be death. They were also deployed as part of a broader eugenics movement that labeled certain people to be undesirable, undeserving, and targeted for elimination, which is, in fact, the very thing that religious conservatives are doing to trans people. So if anything, the argument goes the other way, especially notably with the parallels around withholding treatment. One last point about knowing what you need to know, and I could go on forever when it comes to that aspect, but another thing that I think is important to do is make connections between various hateful movements. We're seeing anti-CRT, anti-gay, anti-abortion, anti-immigrant, and eugenicist movements crop up all at the same time. And I would say that's not an accident. And here again, I refer back to our upcoming Truth Out article with my friend Blue Buchanan. These movements are all arms of a broader white supremacist agenda and are being organized around theories like the Great Replacement or white genocide. Ideas that, to go back to the part one of my presentation, ideas that largely are the same between Nazism and current conservative discourse against trans people, against, critical race theory, etc. That are predicated on this, idea that white people are being put in a demographic minority, or are losing their political power to an other that is seen as primarily in racial terms, but also, in terms of sexuality and gender modality. And the reason, of course, being that, again, trans people, queer people are often seen as conspiracies by, by Jewish people, or by some world shadow government, deep government, things like that. And think about all the conspiracy theories that are essentially saying, the existence of these people, even though many of them are white, is actually attributable to this other group that we don't consider to be white or that we otherwise consider to be other. It's really important to make these connections, both as a matter of solidarity building, but also as a way of undermining the movements are attacking gender-affirming care, because these connections exist whether or not we acknowledge them, but they also help us understand much more the psychology of anti-trans attacks. Sadly, I'm out of witch's brew. So that's kind of the end of my part on how to counter misinformation. Now I move on the using the power and the authority that you have. And that's a part that I also expect to be perhaps a little bit controversial, but I really want you to kind of sit with it and think about it, and think about your place in the world and your values and the values you want to carry, not just as a bioethicist, but also as a person more generally. I appreciate that many people are fearful of sticking their necks out and are fearful of personal consequences, but we also have to recognize that there are lives at stake, that the survival of a community, of an entire community, is at stake, and that through them, so at stake is our own identity and our soul. Will we be remembered as those who stood by the rise of fascism, or those who stood up against it? And, you know, I think there's also, if you want to bring a little bit of self-interest in it, you know, attacks on tenure, attacks on other minority groups are also on the horizon, if not in a great many cases already occurring. You know, like attacks on tenure, so far only a few states, but it's spreading. And we're already seeing, you know, ongoing and really hardening anti-Blackness, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and xenophobic sentiments throughout the United States, sentiments that are not by any stretch of the imagination new, but that are also really kind of sharply on the rise. And if they're tied, as I suggest they are, then defending trans people is also partly self-interest. So what does it mean to use the power and authority you have? Well, the first is to make your voice heard. There's a need for loud vocal dissidence, especially on the part of professional associations, of institutions, and of individuals who have institutional power and authority. It can be things like putting out position statements, writing amicus curiae briefs, writing op-eds. You can also reach out to advocacy organizations and legal organizations to offer your expertise in legal cases or in legislative sessions. You know, I think there is an understandable reticence in kind of saying, oh, you know, what if I do this wrong? What if I'm, you know, taking a place that should be to trans people? And there's certainly a big discussion to be had about how to best do that. But we're also well past the point where allies should just kind of sit back, you know, yes, do this work with us, but also don't be afraid to take the lead in terms of labor, because we're all burnt out. And there's no way we can do this against better funded opponents if people aren't proactive in their allyship. It's not enough to just be available. There's a need to be really proactive. Act as a loudspeaker for the voices of trans people, and especially of trans scholars. Actively give them platforms, opportunities, and positions to trans bioethicists, to other trans scholars. Connect them to influential folks and decision makers. Do all you can to get them in the room, to get their voice to the public, to get their voice to decision makers, to get their voice to politicians. You know, use your position to make them heard. Another point is, don't let transphobia go unchallenged. Be, you know, ready to openly criticize and rebut the clinicians and scholars that use their position to spread a message of transphobia, whether we're talking locally in your organization, locally in your kind of city or state, or at, you know, the national or international level. Another point is that in your administrative and editorial work, it's really critical to adequately scrutinize submissions that oppose gender-affirming care, and to seek out the advice of trans scholars and people who've chosen themselves in vetting these submissions, because oftentimes in academia we've been kind of ingrained this way of thinking where we can just let poor quality scholarship or controversial scholarship go by, believing that we can just kind of criticize or rebut it later. But the problem is in the political moment that we have with social media and with also just like the sheer amount of things that are being published that are creating kind of huge noise. Because of that, by the time the stuff is published, the damage is already done. You can rebut, but the rebuttal will never have the same influence as the original publications, and politicians and anti-trans groups will simply run with it and tax any opposition of being censorship, instead of recognizing that a lot of that opposition is really in fact correcting the record, is correcting for the fact that poor quality science and bioethical thinking was published, things that should honestly just never have been published, not just out of kind of justice and ethical concern, but also like just literally because it's bad as a matter of intellectual honesty and quality, etc. Another big point is to change the materiality of the political fight. Create pressures where you can by refusing to collaborate with or to give resources to anti-trans institutions and governments. Make it cost them. With the other hand, actively give money and resources to trans communities, be it to fund advocacy, to fund education, to fund services. Also fund test cases and legal challenges. As a profession, we have quite a big amount of money, especially in medical institutions, a lot of money in medicine. We can fund this, and it's very much part of our, I would say, kind of job as bioethicists. At the more interpersonal level, I would say, well, institutional level, let's say, pay for the mental health care of trans professors and graduate students, and offer course releases so that they can avoid burning out and they can engage in advocacy, because for a lot of trans people, it's really damn hard to keep on kind of business as usual right now. And a lot of the work that we, have to do ends up making it really much harder for us to engage in advocacy at a time where we're facing, arguably genocidal threats to our community. In similar fashion, kind of on the same train of thought of something I said like a couple sentences ago, which is create legal defense funds for patients, for families, for gender-affirming clinicians, and the people who defend them. By creating legal defense fund, we can reduce the dangers associated with them continuing to do their work. And now we get to what is going to be really my most controversial recommendation, which is civil disobedience. And this is the one that people are going to have to sit with. And I want to suggest that bioethics, the history of bioethics, baked into the history of bioethics, baked into its very philosophy and soul, is the idea that ethical standards should prevail over legal ones. The Nuremberg trials are a testament to this idea. The entire point is that just because the law says so doesn't mean you can do unethical stuff, and that even if the law forces you to do something unethical, you should just say no. What does that mean? Well, if you're on the licensing board, you should refuse to investigate, hear, or rule on complaints that target gender affirmation. You should support your colleagues in offering gender-affirming care despite bans by publicly supporting them and by covering for them as the situation calls. Change billing codes, hide trans patients, erase any trace that could help the state track down affirming families to take away their child. Refuse to give out information when you're asked. A lot of that is not illegal. It is strategic, however. And when you simply can't prevent the application of unjust laws, well, that's the time for malicious compliance. Grind the process down to a halt. Be so slow and painful that you make them really regret going on this path. Disrupt the system. Make all of this hatred impossible. And it's going to be my last point, which is be gay, do crimes isn't just a political slogan. Sometimes it's also a bioethical principle. All right, so this is where I want to end now, because I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of questions. I already start seeing questions popping up. And so I'll now be moving on to the Q&A period.
Thank you so much, Florence. I think I'll start with the comment that we just had come in. Madeline Kroll, who's in Texas, notes that organizations have been deafeningly silent in states where fascism is on the march, and asks how we can, as academics, encourage these institutions to do their due diligence and advocate for trans populations. They offer the case in point of the Texas Association of Medicine, while initially supportive of trans healthcare, abandoned trans minors during the legislative debate, suggesting that ethics are really a matter of convenience.
Well, there's many ways, and partly depends on the relationship you have with these organizations. One is be loud, point and shame, make, which goes back to change the materiality of the situation. A lot of them who are initially purportive, one, see a backlash coming and are fearful of this kind of backlash and want to protect themselves. And also see that the other side doesn't have much pressure that it can do on them, cannot really act to their detriment. So change that calculus for them. Be a pain in their ass. Malicious compliance. Make things difficult for them in whatever way you can. Organize with people who have a lot of power and authority to embarrass them for abandoning trans youth and abandoning bioethics and science to the hand of what is essentially medical fascism. Honestly, if there was an easy way, we probably wouldn't be here. But there are pressure points in organizations, and a lot of it is about learning what those pressure points are, and then being, finding where pressure point is, and essentially, making it hard for them to do this, to abandon communities like that. I wish there was a simpler, more effective answer, but I have some faith in the ability of people to collectively act.
So we have a couple questions in the chat that are about evidence. Before we get there, I just wanted to ask more broadly if you have advice for well-intentioned listeners who want to counter misinformation. Are there sources that you suggest? Are there particular tactics you've had success with? How do you think about countering specifically trans misinformation?
Yeah, so there are various resources. I recall there is a American Psychological Association resource page on countering misinformation around trans care, which can be helpful. Otherwise, familiarizing yourself with some of the kind of big points in the literature, for like rapid onset gender dysphoria, reading my work and the work of R.G. Restar, reading the CAAPS statement around it, around randomized controlled trial, familiarizing yourself with the literature that is critical of what they call evidence-based medicine as a sort of fetishization of randomized controlled trials, and keep an eye out for the upcoming publication on this topic. I wish there was a more of a central kind of hub for that. I've been slowly working on annotated bibliography that I hope will be helpful towards that. But the problem is I'm kind of lacking the resources to really fully flesh that out and make it available for the public. But yeah, so look at the APA resources and then kind of look into some of the specific forms of misinformation. There's also some interesting work in communication studies around misinformation. Most recently, an article by TJ Billard, who is the executive director of the Center for Applied Transgender Studies, around anti-trans feminisms as relying on misinformation in regard to trans rights. So things to look at around that. But yeah, there's no, unfortunately, kind of what is lacking is kind of a really kind of central hub for all of that learning. But you can also you can keep an eye out. There are some trainings more and more that go into much more kind of specifics around certain issues and stuff. So yeah.
Great, thank you. So let me redo the more narrow questions here about evidence. So we've got a question from Grayson Jackson, who I think is also in Texas. Some parents and legislators cite impact on neurocognitive development as a reason for opposing puberty blockers. Is there actually any evidence or a lack of evidence on this point?
Yeah, so there's really not much in the way of evidence around neurocognitive development. What often occurs is that you have studies that look at a bunch of different stuff and just open themselves up to I don't want to say p-hacking because I don't think it's intentional, but essentially kind of false positives, because they test so many associations that at some point you're just going to inevitably have stuff that demonstrates a statistically significant relationship, but that with an appropriate adjustment for multiple comparisons would disappear. Another thing that I think is a big problem when people are kind of looking at data and mobilizing rhetoric around puberty blockers is that they'll seem to forget what puberty blockers are, which are your on purpose creating a lag in pubertal development. In part because you don't want to have the youth go on hormone therapy right away, which is really more of a question of the comfort of clinicians and parents than about what the youth wants and needs. But if you're creating a lag, then any measure is gonna look poorly is gonna start to look like it's degrading over time, because almost all measures of, well, almost anything in childhood are tied to age, and puberty are tied to, like if you're looking at bone density, it looks like bones are getting weaker. When what is really happening is that because your puberty is delayed, other people's bones are changing, yours aren't yet. And once you go through exogenous puberty, your bones are going to start changing. So creating a lag. So of course we expect measures to have this lag, and we have to interpret them accordingly. So I think like a lot of time, like kind of that's what's happening, and then people are raising a lot of panic around that. But there's a big, there's a big question around, well, yeah, that's kind of the entire point, to have this sort of like developmental lag. Now, we could argue that as some do, we should just start youth on hormone therapy right away so that they have a puberty at the same time as their peers. And I think, in many ways that might be quite good. But, so long as we're thinking about the point of puberty blockers, then yeah, you're gonna have measurements that are gonna diverge from an age-matched norm, because the entire point of puberty blockers is that you're creating this lag with people of the same age group. That doesn't necessarily, by itself, it's not cause for concern. What would be cause for concern is if we had evidence that this lag is, precludes that, level of development in the future if you can't come back from this lag, essentially.
And so our second question is from an anonymous asker. I really appreciate your point that for all the criticism regarding lack of strong data in favor of gender care for trans youth, there's even less data against gender care. One question I have is that for trans youth, I understand the Dutch model was the first care model and the model that is currently implemented in the US. How do you think about some of the European countries moving away from the Dutch model? What do you think is motivating this?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about the Dutch model, which is very weird because that's just not true that the Dutch model is what's used in the US. For one, the Dutch model is defined, yes, in part by the use of puberty blockers, which, by the way, they tend to be much more conservative about who they allow to be on puberty blockers and when they allow people to be on puberty blockers. But the Dutch model was also defined, by contrast to gender-affirming model, by the fact that they didn't want to allow kids to socially transition before puberty. The Dutch model is very fundamentally, deeply conservative from the get-go. And if you look back at a lot of the kind of earlier publication of the Dutch team, this is like very, very conservative, including just like straight up very sexist things like saying that some kids are probably trans because so some trans girls are probably trans because they are not smart and active enough to be able to keep up with boys, which is just like very basic issue sexism. So this idea that like the Dutch model, well, yeah, of course they're gonna, of course a lot of these European teams are cracking down on trans care. They never wanted to, they were never committed to really offering it in the first place. They allowed it in relatively few youth, and a lot of their practices were geared towards, hoping that youth would just like change their mind and not want to go on puberty blockers, not want to go on hormones and things like that. So, and they used extremely stereotyping and kind of oftentimes arbitrary assessment methods in order to kind of decide who should be eligible for it. So it's not at all a surprise that they're, kind of walking that back, because in many ways they're not walking it back. They're just kind of following through with what was always their logic. One example was recently, and that's from Canada, Susan Bradley of the CAMH Gender Identity Clinic for children and youth went to conservative media being like, oh, I was one of the pioneers of offering puberty blockers and hormone to youth, and I regret it. I'm like, your clinic was closed amidst very credible allegations of doing conversion therapy on trans youth. I wrote a book on conversion therapy and spent a lot of the book looking into the publications of the CAMH team to conclude that the practices that they describe are just very unambiguously conversion therapy. They're trying to prevent kids from growing up trans. They're trying to make kids accept their natal body. The fact that they allowed a couple kids to transition does not make them non-transphobic or non-conservative. And so it's really not surprising that now that they're in a kind of political environment that's very reactionary, that they're really adopting or letting themselves be influenced by a lot of those talking points. The Dutch team, as far as I'm concerned, has no real credibility or authority in sort of like, moral terms or bioethical terms around this. The fact that they were the first kind of big clinic who published about allowing, some level of treatment was part of a broader movement of, we discourage all the youth that we can, and then we let a little trickle of a few youth that, we see as kind of irredeemable, kind of a lot of that, which is a pattern we've seen in the US since the birth of trans medicine, as demonstrated really eloquently by a recent article by Elliot Marrow in Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. So yeah, no, I just I don't see why people are taking these changes in Europe as, narrating it as some sort of kind of progressive group of clinicians that are moving towards a more conservative side. If you ask any Dutch activist or scholar, they'll tell you they were never very progressive. They're always very conservative in their care offers. And this is just a continuation of that.
Okay, so we've got a question from Siri Rigsby. I'm curious about your perspective on the dichotomous relationship set between parents' rights and children's rights when it comes to consenting to care. For example, in my work, I run into issues where the option of an absent parent on a patient's gender-affirming surgery is prioritized alongside the trans youth and the present parent. This feels deeply frustrating and unethical.
Yeah, so, and I mean, I have, and this is like partly, I think, like a little bit of a US thing, because coming from Canada, there's no such thing as parental rights. And that's also kind of generally the international position under the Convention for the Rights of the Child. They use sometimes the language parental rights, but really what parents have aren't rights, they're power and responsibilities. Parents exercise children's rights in many ways. That's what surrogate decision making is. It's parents exercising the autonomy rights of the child, but parents don't have, at least in Canada and at the kind of international level, don't have rights against the child by themselves. Everything is about the best interest of the child, and parental actions that go against the best interest of the child are, not meant to be empowered or followed. And so, to me, this idea of parental rights is very weird, and also so deeply hypercritical in the context that the people who are using this narrative of parental rights are also saying we must protect children. How does parental rights supposed to fit into that when you're claiming that parents have rights vis-a-vis their children instead of, of focusing on children's best interests and their own rights? Now, there's a practical element, which is including all parents can be a strategic decision in order to bolster your potential position in future litigation. Courts may be hostile to the idea of like not having included a parent in conversations in a way that it might not be if a parent was included in conversations, but ultimately overridden in terms of decisions because they were unreasonably opposed to something that was in the best interests of the child. So, I would say whenever you're looking at the question of like the role of parents and the role of family, it's important to think in two terms. First, what is best for the child? What is beneficial for the child? And two, what is strategic here? What does acting strategically dictate here? Which itself is ultimately thinking about the long-term or medium-term best interests of the child.
So I'm afraid that's all that we've got time for. I want to encourage attendees to send any unanswered questions to L. Palmer, that's LPALMER @ASBH.org. And I want to thank Florence so much for being here. Sabrina, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, just thank you both. Florence, that was so educational and really very helpful. So thank you for sharing with us today. And Theo, thanks so much for moderating. Really appreciate it. Thank you to our attendees, and we look forward to continuing these conversations. Bye, everybody.